World War I, often called the Great War, engulfed the globe in one of the most devastating conflicts in human history. This massive struggle saw the world's major powers align into two opposing coalitions: the Allied powers, including Britain, France, and later the United States, and the Central Powers, led by Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. The war's ripple effects shaped nations and alliances, redrawing borders and transforming empires. In 1917, the United States formally entered the war, tipping the balance of power in favor of the Allies. President Woodrow Wilson declared war on Germany, citing unrestricted submarine warfare and the infamous Zimmermann telegram as provocations. Yet, despite the Ottoman Empire being a key member of the Central Powers, America refrained from declaring war on this declining but strategically vital empire. This apparent omission raises an intriguing question: why did the United States not include the Ottoman Empire in its declaration of war? The Ottoman Empire controlled vast territories in the Middle East, including key strategic regions, and played a significant role in battles like Gallipoli and Palestine. Its actions during the war, including controversial events like the Armenian Genocide, had global implications. In this episode, we delve into the complex web of geopolitics, strategy, and diplomacy that shaped America's wartime priorities. From logistical challenges to political calculations, we uncover the nuanced reasons behind this decision, shedding light on how it shaped the post-war world order. Stay tuned as we unravel this fascinating chapter of history. The Ottoman Empire, once a powerful and vast empire, found itself on the side of the Central Powers during World War I. Though its glory days were behind it, the Ottomans still held significant territories, including parts of the Middle East, North Africa, and the Balkans. When the war broke out, the Ottomans aligned themselves with Germany and Austria-Hungary, hoping to regain lost territories and preserve their crumbling empire. Their involvement in the war began with military actions that targeted the British and Russian empires in the Middle East and the Caucasus. One of the most notable campaigns involving the Ottoman Empire was the Gallipoli campaign in 1915. This campaign saw Ottoman forces, under the leadership of Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, successfully defend the Dardanelles Strait against a combined British, French, and Australian force. The Ottomans' victory at Gallipoli was significant, as it bolstered their morale and demonstrated their military capability. It also helped to maintain control over the vital access points between the Aegean Sea and the Black Sea. In addition to their role in the European theater, the Ottomans also played a crucial part in the Middle East. Their forces fought against the British and their allies in areas like Mesopotamia, the Sinai Peninsula, and Palestine. The Ottomans were able to hold off British advances for a time, but the tide eventually turned in favor of the Allies. Despite their strategic importance, the Ottomans' entry into the war was not enough to alter the overall balance of power. The empire also became a target for the Allied powers, who sought to weaken it from within. The British offered support to Arab nationalist movements, leading to the Arab Revolt, which further strained Ottoman resources. The Ottomans, already stretched thin, found themselves battling on multiple fronts, ultimately contributing to their downfall in the post-war period. Despite their significant involvement in the war, the Ottoman Empire's role was somewhat overshadowed by the larger battles occurring in Europe. This, along with shifting global priorities, played a part in why the United States never declared war on the Ottomans, even as they remained an integral part of the Central Powers. During World War I, America's initial stance was one of neutrality. President Woodrow Wilson and many Americans believed that the war in Europe was a conflict that the United States should avoid. The country had a long-standing tradition of non-intervention in European conflicts, and the focus was largely on domestic issues, including economic development and social progress. America's primary interests were centered on maintaining trade relations and safeguarding its economy, rather than involving itself in the political and military dynamics of Europe. However, as the war progressed, American priorities began to shift. While the United States was neutral at the start of the war, it was not entirely disengaged from the global stage. America's economic ties to the Allied powers, especially Britain and France, grew stronger. The U.S. provided them with loans, supplies, and other forms of support. At the same time, German unrestricted submarine warfare, which targeted American merchant ships, began to escalate tensions. The sinking of ships like the Lusitania in 1915, with the loss of American lives, was a critical turning point. These incidents made it harder for the U.S. to maintain its neutral stance. Despite the growing tensions with Germany and other Central Powers, the Ottoman Empire was not a primary concern for the United States. Although the Ottoman Empire was part of the Central Powers, it did not directly threaten American interests. The focus of U.S. foreign policy during the war was more on Germany, with its aggressive submarine warfare and the ongoing conflict in Europe. The United States was primarily concerned with ensuring the safety of its citizens and ships, as well as maintaining its economic stability. It was more strategically significant for the U.S. to focus on Germany, as it was the primary military threat, particularly in the Atlantic Ocean. Moreover, the Ottoman Empire's military campaigns were distant from American shores, and the empire itself was perceived as weakening. The U.S. viewed the Ottoman Empire as a declining power, whose influence and military capabilities were diminishing. As a result, the Ottomans were not considered a major player in the conflict, especially compared to the more formidable threat posed by Germany. The United States, therefore, chose to focus its resources and military efforts on Germany, the main adversary of the Allies. Additionally, America's involvement in the war was also shaped by the need to balance domestic and international concerns. The U.S. had a growing interest in international trade, and keeping relations stable with the Allied powers was critical to maintaining its economic dominance. The Ottoman Empire, which had already been in decline for decades, did not pose the same level of economic or strategic importance to the U.S. as the European powers did. Thus, America's involvement was more focused on supporting the Allied powers in their fight against Germany and Austria-Hungary, rather than engaging with the Ottomans. As the war neared its end, the collapse of the Ottoman Empire became more certain. The empire's defeat was seen as inevitable, and the United States did not perceive a need to escalate tensions further with the Ottomans. Instead, U.S. efforts were aimed at post-war diplomacy and ensuring the stability of Europe, particularly in dealing with the rise of new nations and the restructuring of empires. In summary, America's strategic focus during World War I was on Germany and its allies, including Austria-Hungary, due to the direct threats posed to American interests. While the Ottoman Empire played a role in the conflict, its influence was not seen as significant enough to warrant a declaration of war by the United States. The focus on European powers and the broader global dynamics of the war meant that the U.S. directed its attention elsewhere, leaving the Ottomans largely unchallenged by American forces. During World War I, the United States faced a series of political and diplomatic considerations that influenced its decision to refrain from declaring war on the Ottoman Empire. President Woodrow Wilson's administration navigated a complex web of international relationships, balancing domestic opinion, economic interests, and global strategy. The U.S. had a long-standing policy of avoiding entanglement in foreign conflicts, especially in Europe and the Middle East, and these considerations shaped the country's foreign policy during the war. One of the key political considerations was America's desire to maintain its neutral stance for as long as possible. While the United States was sympathetic to the Allied cause, especially in its opposition to the Central Powers, Wilson sought to avoid direct military involvement. This was partly due to the political climate at home. The majority of Americans, particularly those of German and Irish descent, opposed U.S. entry into the war. The U.S. had a significant immigrant population, and many of these groups held sympathies for Germany or the Allied powers. Wilson's administration had to carefully manage these political pressures, balancing the desires of different ethnic and political groups within the United States. The diplomatic considerations also played a major role in the decision to avoid confrontation with the Ottoman Empire. At the time, the Ottoman Empire was a major power in the Middle East, controlling large swaths of territory that included modern-day Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and Palestine. While the empire had joined the Central Powers, its military capabilities were limited, and the Ottomans were considered a secondary threat compared to the more powerful nations of Germany and Austria-Hungary. The United States had little to gain from antagonizing the Ottoman Empire, which was already struggling with internal issues, including nationalist uprisings and the gradual collapse of its territorial holdings. In addition, the U.S. maintained a significant diplomatic relationship with the Ottoman Empire before the war. The Ottoman Empire had historically been a part of the broader geopolitical balance of power in the Middle East, and the U.S. had maintained diplomatic ties with it for many years. While these ties were not as strong as America's relations with European powers like Britain and France, the Ottoman Empire had been an important partner in terms of trade and regional stability. The U.S. had a vested interest in maintaining these relations, particularly as the war unfolded and the Middle East became a more critical area of focus. The Ottoman Empire's control of key trade routes, including access to the Suez Canal, was of strategic importance, and the United States did not want to jeopardize these interests by declaring war on the Ottomans. The U.S. also faced challenges in managing its relationship with the Allied powers, who were eager for American support in their fight against the Central Powers. Britain and France, in particular, wanted the U.S. to declare war on the Ottoman Empire, as they recognized the empire as a vulnerable link in the Central Powers alliance. However, Wilson's administration remained cautious, mindful of the political risks involved in alienating American public opinion. The U.S. also understood that the war effort against Germany and Austria-Hungary would be the primary focus, and that expanding the conflict to include the Ottoman Empire might complicate the war strategy and stretch American resources. Moreover, the diplomatic consequences of declaring war on the Ottoman Empire would have had far-reaching effects on post-war negotiations. The United States, under Wilson's leadership, sought to shape the post-war world order through principles of self-determination and collective security, as outlined in the 14 points. The U.S. was already involved in discussions with the Allied powers about how to address the collapse of empires, particularly the Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman empires, in a way that would prevent future conflicts. By not declaring war on the Ottomans, the U.S. maintained the flexibility to influence the post-war peace settlement in a way that aligned with its interests. Furthermore, there was an awareness that the Ottoman Empire's participation in the war was already weakening. The Ottoman military was ill-equipped to fight a prolonged war on multiple fronts, and internal dissent was growing within the empire. The U.S. government may have calculated that the Ottoman Empire would eventually collapse under the pressure of the war, and therefore, the necessity of engaging in military conflict with the Ottomans seemed unnecessary. The Ottomans were already losing battles, and their strategic position was deteriorating rapidly, which meant that the U.S. did not view them as a major threat compared to the Central Powers' more formidable forces. In conclusion, the political and diplomatic considerations of the United States during World War I played a crucial role in its decision not to declare war on the Ottoman Empire. The U.S. government sought to maintain neutrality for as long as possible, balancing domestic political pressures, economic interests, and international relationships. Diplomatic ties with the Ottoman Empire, the limited strategic threat posed by the Ottomans, and the broader geopolitical context of the war all influenced the U.S. decision. By avoiding direct conflict with the Ottoman Empire, the United States preserved its flexibility in shaping post-war diplomacy and focused its military and economic resources on the primary threats posed by Germany and Austria-Hungary. Economic and geographic factors played a significant role in the United States' decision not to declare war on the Ottoman Empire during World War I. Although the Ottoman Empire was part of the Central Powers, its geographical location and economic interactions with the U.S. made a direct military engagement less appealing. From an economic perspective, the U.S. had limited economic interests directly tied to the Ottoman Empire, especially when compared to the broader commercial relationships America had with European powers. The United States had growing trade relations with Britain, France, and other allied nations, but the Ottoman Empire, which was already weakening during the war, did not present a significant economic threat or opportunity. The U.S. had a modest level of trade with the Ottomans, focusing on commodities like cotton, tobacco, and foodstuffs, but these exchanges were not substantial enough to warrant military involvement. By contrast, America's economic ties to the Allied nations were far more lucrative, with much larger trade volumes and investments in the European markets. Geographically, the Ottoman Empire was located far from the continental United States, and its military actions were primarily concentrated in the Middle East and parts of Eastern Europe. While the U.S. had interests in the region, especially in terms of trade routes and access to oil, the Ottoman Empire's strategic importance in comparison to other regions was limited. The U.S. did not view the Ottomans as a direct military threat, particularly given the distance and the fact that most of the war was fought in Europe. America's focus was on the Atlantic and European theaters of war, where the major battles were taking place, and where the U.S. could have the most significant impact. Furthermore, the US was aware of the potential costs associated with expanding the war into the Ottoman territories. The Middle East was a region already embroiled in political and military turmoil, and America had little desire to engage in another complex and distant conflict. Any intervention in the Ottoman Empire would have involved logistical challenges, with long supply lines and difficult terrain, especially with the empire controlling vast and diverse territories that stretched from modern-day Turkey to the Arabian Peninsula. In conclusion, the economic and geographic factors influenced the U.S. decision to avoid direct conflict with the Ottoman Empire during World War I. The U.S. did not have significant economic ties to the empire, and its strategic interests were more focused on Europe and the Allied powers. The Ottoman Empire's location and the complexities of engaging in a war in the Middle East made military intervention seem unnecessary, particularly when the U.S. was already involved in a larger conflict in Europe. In conclusion, the United States' decision not to declare war on the Ottoman Empire during World War I can be attributed to a combination of strategic, economic, and diplomatic factors. While the Ottoman Empire was part of the Central Powers, it did not pose a significant direct threat to U.S. interests. America's focus was primarily on the European theater, where the majority of the war's key battles took place. The U.S. had more substantial economic ties with the Allied nations, and its involvement in the war was largely driven by the need to support these powers rather than confront the Ottomans directly. Additionally, the geographic distance and the complexity of military engagement in the Middle East made intervention less appealing. The United States was cautious about extending the war into Ottoman territories, especially given the logistical challenges and the instability of the region. Ultimately, the Ottomans did not present an immediate threat that warranted U.S. military involvement, and America's priorities were focused elsewhere, particularly on defeating the more powerful Central Powers and securing a decisive victory in Europe. This combination of factors ensured that the Ottoman Empire remained largely outside the scope of U.S. military actions during the war.